Well, it's good to be back with you again this evening. Appreciate the singing. I like the part where the women just sing. I'm not trying to say I don't like to hear the men sing, but I really like the part where the men just be quiet for a minute, listen to the women sing. You guys have some beautiful voices, and just enjoy that section. If I'm allowed, can I enjoy it? Is that okay? It's good to be here. Tonight we're going to do an evening evidence lesson, and it's coming. There's a lot of movement going on here in front of me right now, so I'm a little distracted by the screen. There we go. We were supposed to do this lesson at the start of the month, and our projector blew up, and so we didn't do it. I was going to do it next week. I'm not going to be here next week, so it's not going to be on the first Sunday evening evidence. I hope that's okay with everybody, but we're going to do it tonight. So whether it's 3 weeks late or a week early, I'll let you decide that, but I want to make sure we cover this lesson before I head out of town. I'll be in Evansville, Indiana in a meeting starting next Sunday. That'll be Sunday through Friday, and so I won't be with you next week. In Exodus 15 and verse 26, you read this verse that Evan just read to us, and I'll read it to you again just so it's fresh in your mind. If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. The people of Israel were governed by the law of Moses until Jesus Christ. And many of the laws of Moses, to some, they may seem archaic and they may seem pointless, but the promise of God through the pens of writers such as Moses and such as Solomon point to a blessed and a healthy life if the commands of God were obeyed. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, in verses 1 through 4, if we kind of look at a few sections in there, Moses connects obedience to blessing and even physical blessing. If you take a look at verse 1, it says, "Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments which I command you today, all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God." And then he says, "Blessed shall be the fruit of your body." So there was physical blessing, clearly physical blessing that was connected to obedience to God here in Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 15, you'll also find that he connects disobedience to physical curses. So just like obedience could bring physical blessing, disobedience could bring physical cursing to the people of Israel. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15, and we're just going to look at a few excerpts from several verses here, but it says, "It shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body." That's clearly physical. "The Lord will strike you with consumption, with fever, with inflammation, with severe burning fever." That's clearly physical. "The boils of Egypt with tumors, with the scab, and with the itch from which you cannot be healed." Some of these consequences may have been through the direct actions of God, but some of them may very well have been natural consequences of disobeying the law of Moses. I mean, after all, the law was inspired by a God who had the foreknowledge to see the medical problems that would occur if certain actions were taken before they ever happened. Solomon also connects obedience to a healthy life. These are a few excerpts from Solomon in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 7. It says, "Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh." It's very specific about that. Health to your flesh and strength to your bones. It will help you physically if you just respect the Lord's will. In Proverbs 4 and verse 20, "My son, give attention to my words. They are life to those who find them." Now, I think you could think about spiritual life to those who find them, but there's also a physical element here, health to all their flesh. In Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 11, it says, "The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in delight and strengthen your bones. You shall be like a watered garden And then if we look at the New Testament, we can see in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, while clearly the benefits of a godly life, they're primarily spiritual in Scripture, there's also physical benefit. So 1 Timothy 4 verse 8 says, bodily exercise profits a little. It's better for your health. But godliness is profitable for all things. Now, we quote these scriptures to say this: if the inspired writers promise a healthier physical life as a result of a godly life, we should be able to find some evidence of their medical claims in the pages of the scriptures themselves. And I think we do. But before we begin to look at some of what Moses wrote, I'm specifically mostly going to be looking at Moses and some of the things that he wrote, I'd like for you to first of all consider that Moses was from Egypt. And so if Moses was just echoing what he'd learned in Egypt, when we start reading a little bit about what Moses said, if he was just echoing what he learned in Egypt, we would expect to find similar instructions in ancient Egyptian medical records. And actually what we find when we look at the law of Moses and some of the things that were commanded there, and what we see expected in some of the ancient Egyptian medical records, is not consistency, but contrast. There were things that Moses taught that were not consistent with what the wise Egyptians taught medically in their day. And that's kind of interesting, considering that the Egyptians were world leaders in the field of medicine in their time. Now, there's a document that helps us to compare the wisdom of God through the writings of Moses to the wisdom of the Egyptians. And that paper, that document is called the Ebers Papyrus. Now, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, we'll just quote from them on this, the Ebers Papyrus is an Egyptian compilation of medical texts dated back to about 1550 BC. So it's one of the oldest known medical works. The scroll contains 700 magical formulas and folk remedies that are meant to cure afflictions ranging from crocodile bite to toenail pain and to rid the house of pests such as flies and rats and scorpions. It also includes a surprisingly accurate description of the circulatory system, noting the existence of blood vessels throughout the body and the heart's function as the center of the blood supply. The Ebers Papyrus was acquired by George Maurice Ebers, who was a German Egyptologist and a novelist. It was acquired in 1873. Now, keep in mind that at this time, as Massengill writes in a sketch of medicine and pharmacy, Egypt was the medical center of the ancient world. They were considered the best and the brightest when it came to medical practices at this time. In the days of the Persians, King Darius's practice was to keep in attendance certain Egyptian doctors because they had a reputation for the highest eminence in their profession. Herodotus writes about this in the histories. But I want to point out to you that not all Egyptians were always so wise. Let me give you a few examples of that. There's a few ancient Egyptian practices that are found in the Ebers Papyrus that document, and you just tell me if the remedy sounds wise to you. For example, to draw out splinters. This was one of the remedies. A remedy is prescribed consisting of worm blood, mole, and donkey dung. That sound like a good way to draw out a splinter out of a finger? Doctors Macmillan and David Stern note that dung is loaded with tetanus spores, and a simple splinter often resulted in a gruesome death from lockjaw. Not very smart. To heal skin diseases, this was one of the things that you'd find in the Ebers Papyrus. They would take a hog's tooth, cat's dung, dog's dung, of samu oil, bears of the zeti plant. They would pound and they would apply it as a poultice. I think I'll just stick with the skin disease. I don't know, right? To prevent hair growth, they would take lizard dung and the blood from a cow, donkey, pig, dog, and stag. That would help prevent hair growth, right? And to treat sore eyes, this was found in the Ebers Papyrus from Egypt. Massengill writes this in a sketch of medicine and pharmacy. He says, the early Egyptian physicians made considerable use of drugs. Their drugs were of the kind usually found in early civilizations, a few effective remedies lost in a mass of substances of purely superstitious origin. They used opium, squill, and other vegetable substances, but also excrement and urine. It is said the urine of a faithful wife was with them effective in the treatment of sore eyes. I'll just keep the sore eyes, But these were things that you'd find in medical documents from Egypt that were supposed to be helping people. Well, I would point out to you that the wisdom of the Egyptians is sometimes clearly in conflict to the wisdom of God. I'm pretty sure that most doctors today, if they were to use some of these concoctions that the Egyptians had come up with for certain treatments, they would be sued for malpractice if these were some of the prescriptions that they had used for their clients. And I know I wouldn't want to be a patient in an Egyptian medical clinic if that's some of the stuff that you're using, right? Now, thankfully, we never see this sort of medical error in the text of Scripture. You do find it in ancient Egypt. You do find it in some of their documents, but you don't find that kind of error in ancient Scripture. And yet, some of these flawed medical practices of ancient Egypt lead us to consider a question, and that is, was Moses, who was raised, when you read Acts 7, it says of Moses, he was raised in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Was he influenced by the medical malpractice of these Egyptians in his writings? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books are compiled and they are authored by Moses. And admittedly, they are not devoted entirely to the enumeration of medical prescriptions, and they are not ancient medical textbooks. But these books do, however, contain numerous regulations of sanitation, of quarantine, of other medical procedures that were to govern the daily lives of the Israelite nation, that were to make the nation more healthy and more sanitary. And interestingly, missing entirely from the pages of these writings are the harmful remedies and ingredients that were prescribed by other ancient civilizations. In fact, the Pentateuch, I think, exhibits an understanding of germs and disease that much modern medicine did not grasp for 3,500 years after these books were written. Now, Moses had been trained under the most advanced Egyptian educational system of his day. And with such training, it would have been natural for Moses to include some of that Egyptian wisdom in his writings if he were composing the Pentateuch by using his own prowess and his own mental faculties. But a look into the medical practices from ancient Egypt and those found in the Pentateuch reveals that Moses did not necessarily rely on wisdom from the Egyptians, which in many cases would have consisted of life-threatening malpractice. While some medical practices in the Pentateuch are similar to those found in ancient Egyptian documents, the Pentateuch exhibits a conspicuous absence of those harmful malpractices that plagued the writings of the Egyptians. Moses actually penned the most advanced, flawless medical prescriptions that had ever been recorded in every statement that pertained to the health and the medical well-being of the Israelite nation, recorded by Moses, could theoretically still be implemented and be completely in accord with every fact that modern medicine has learned in regard to germ spreading, epidemic disease control, communal sanitation, and a host of other medical and scientific discoveries. So that's an evidence worth noting and studying as we contrast the all-wise God with the wise but the fallible Egyptians. And so today I want to think with you about the medical foreknowledge of God. We're going to look at 5 things, 5 simple things that I think you see in the law of Moses, that where Moses was clearly before his time. So I want you to consider the evidence for inspiration that exists as we think about the medical foreknowledge of God in several areas. Let's start with this one. Moses and the importance of blood. Now, blood, I think we know, blood is the liquid of life, right? Blood has great purpose for us in our lives. It helps circulate the proteins and the oxygen that the body needs to survive. Hemoglobin is found in red blood cells, and that hemoglobin transports oxygen to the brain. Without it, the body cannot function. And yet, it was believed in the Middle Ages that blood contained evil vapors. So it took a while for man to figure out the importance of blood. In the past, the ignorance of blood's value caused some learned men to do some pretty tragic things. Some believed that it had harmful vapors that had entered the blood and that it was the blood that was causing sickness. And so what was sometimes applied to people with fevers is they would apply leeches to the victims of fever and other illnesses and attempt to draw out blood containing these vapors. Additionally, a lack of medical knowledge about blood has been historically linked to the practice of bloodletting. Have you heard of bloodletting? Bloodletting is the practice where the veins and the arteries that are located just above the elbow were opened, and the patient's arms were bled to expunge the contaminated blood. So the practice of bloodletting, the idea behind it is that if we just kind of cut somebody open and let them bleed out, we'll get rid of some of the bad blood, and this could possibly save their lives because perhaps their blood is contaminated. I'm trying to click the button, but it's not clicking, so you guys can grab it one time for me back there. Thank you. Now, the goal of this was to rid the body of disease by draining the blood. So one of the most common examples we know about this, right, is George Washington. George Washington was the first president of the United States. He died because of such misplaced medical zeal. There was an eyewitness account of Washington's death that relates that he came down with a chill, and in an effort to cure him, those who attended him resorted to trying to bleed him out. So a vein was opened, no relief was afforded, and Washington eventually died. In some cases, then, bloodletting actually killed the patient. Bleeding a patient killed it because that alters, when you release that much blood, it alters temperature control, it alters waste removal and transportation of food and water throughout the body. Bloodletting was practiced by barbershops. That's why when you see a barbershop sign, you've got that white and that red. You know what that represents? It was a place where you could go and they practiced bloodletting. They had razors to cut your hair, but they had razors to open up your vein too to help you bleed. Thousands of years before the lethal practice of bloodletting was conceived, mankind had been informed by God that blood was indeed the key to life. In Leviticus 17 and verse 11, Moses already had stated, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Simple statement. And today we understand completely the truthfulness of Moses' statement that the life of the flesh is in the blood. But we have to ask, as we think about Moses, how did an ancient shepherd like Moses come to know such information? Was that just a lucky guess? How could Moses have known almost 3,500 years ago that life was in the blood? Well, it took the rest of the scientific and the medical community thousands of years and thousands of lives to grasp that truth. The Old Testament's conspicuous failure to institute improper medical procedures as they related to blood speaks loudly of its medical accuracy. And so Moses and the importance of blood is one such example of the medical foreknowledge of God. Let me notice another one with you. I think when you read some of the rules and the regulations during the time of Moses to the people of Israel, you will find the people of Moses were ahead of their time when it came to germs and when it came to sanitation. In their book, None of These Diseases, a great book, but physicians S.I. McMillan and David Stern, they discussed how many of the hygienic rules established by God for the children of Israel still are applicable today. And to illustrate their point, in this book, they recounted the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. I'll tell you the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1847, there was an obstetrician, and he was named Ignaz Semmelweis, and he was the director of a hospital ward in Vienna, Austria. There were many pregnant women that checked into his ward. but 18% of them never checked out. 1 out of every 6 that received treatment in Semmelweis's ward died of labor fever. Now, autopsies revealed there was pus under their skin and in their chest cavities and in their eye sockets. And Semmelweis was very distraught over the mortality rate in his ward, as you can imagine. He was the director of the hospital ward, and to see 1 out of 6 not leaving the hospital was very concerning. And there were other hospital wards very much like it in Europe that had similar death rates. Newland noted that Australia, the Americas, Britain, Ireland, and practically every other nation that had established a hospital suffered a similar mortality rate, and he wrote about this in 2003. If a woman delivered a baby using a midwife, then the death rate actually fell to about 3%. And so some people might think, well, that's because it was delivered with a midwife, and so it's better to deliver with a midwife. But we're going to see that really wasn't the connection. If she chose to use the most advanced medical knowledge and facilities of the day, her chance of dying skyrocketed immediately and immensely. So Semmelweis, he tried everything to curb the carnage. Let me tell you some things that he tried, because he was just trying to figure out, medical practice, right? Because he was just kind of practicing, trying to see how we could help this. He turned all the women on their sides in the hopes that the death rate would drop, but that didn't have any results. He thought that maybe there was a bell that the priest rang late in the evenings, and maybe that was scaring the women at night. And so maybe that was the reason. So he made the priest enter silently, yet without any drop in the death rates. As he contemplated his dilemma, he watched young medical students perform their routine tasks. And each day, the students would perform autopsies on the dead mothers. Then they would rinse their hands in a bowl of bloody water, wipe them off on a common shared towel, and then they would immediately begin internal examinations of the still living women who were pregnant. You see a problem with that? You just performed an autopsy on a dead, diseased mother, washed your hands in water, and that's it. Wiped your hands on a common towel that everybody else is using that's been touching disease and death, and then you touched a living patient. We see that, and I think we can figure out what the problem is, right? Newland commented concerning the practice. He said, because there seemed no reason for them to wash their hands except superficially or change their clothing before coming to the first division, they did neither. So some weren't washing their hands or changing their clothes. Now, as a 21st century observer, I think we'd be appalled to think that such practices actually took place in institutes of what was at the time modern technology. I mean, what doctor in his right mind would touch a dead person and then perform examinations on living patients without first employing some sort of minimal hygienic practices intended to kill germs? But to Europeans in the middle 19th century, germs were virtually a foreign concept. They never had seen a germ, much less been able to predict its destructive potential. And according to many of their most prevalent theories, disease was caused by atmospheric conditions or cosmic influences. Semmelweis ordered everyone in his ward to wash his or her hands thoroughly in a chlorine solution after every examination. And in 3 months, the death rate fell from 18% to 1%. And Semmelweis had made an amazing discovery. You know what's interesting, though? He was fired for it. The doctors hated the fact that he was forcing them to wash their hands after every single patient in a stinky chlorinated water that dried out their hands, and they fired him. And it wasn't until after he died that he became recognized as a man who was ahead of his time. Had Semmelweis, let me read to you from this quote from None of These Diseases. Ignaz Semmelweis is remembered for the now commonplace notion that doctors must wash their hands before examining patients. In mid-19th century Vienna, this was a subversive idea, and with deaths from childbed fever exploding, Semmelweis discovered that doctors themselves were the ones spreading the disease. Now, had Semmelweis made a groundbreaking discovery, or is it possible that he simply rediscovered what had been known in some circles for many years? Take a look at Numbers 19 and verses 11 and 12. It's here on your screen, because almost 3,300 years before Semmelweis lived, Moses had written this in Numbers 19 and verse 11. He who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. I wonder why. You have germs. You've touched disease. And so they wanted you to stay away from people after that. It says, he shall purify himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not be clean. And germs were no new discovery in 1847. I would suggest to you the biblical text recorded measures to check their spread as far back as approximately 1500 BC. Now, I want you to think about something else that's in this text. It's also one of those ancient examples of medical foreknowledge, and that is the water that they were supposed to use. You see, this wasn't just ordinary water that the person who had touched the dead body was supposed to wash in. This was actually known as the water of purification. So connected to Semmelweis' discovery, if you read Numbers chapter 19, you're going to find some more information about the water of purification. So look at Numbers 19, verses 5 through 9. You may not be able to see it well up here on your screen, so take a look in your own scripture, but I'm going to read it to you. Because if someone was to wash in any type of water, it was to be the water of purification. And there was actually a recipe for it here, if you will, in Numbers 19, 5 through 9. And when you read it, you might think, well, what kind of weird recipe is this? We're going to explain it here in just a minute, okay? The heifer was supposed to be burned in his sight. Its hide, its flesh, its blood, its offal shall be burned. So they took a heifer and they burned it. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast them into the midst of the fire that was burning the heifer. And so basically there was this fire that was created, and it was a fire that was from a heifer, it was from cedar wood, from hyssop, scarlet. You put all of it in the fire, and then the priest shall wash his clothes. So he's touched all of these things. He needs to go wash his clothes. He shall bathe in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until evening. And the one who burns it shall wash his clothes in water, bathe in water, and shall be unclean until evening. And then a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer. Remember, that also included the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet. And they were to store them outside the camp in a clean place. This isn't dirty ash. This isn't supposed to be stored in places where they were doing other things. They were to put it in a clean place, and they shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for the water of purification. It is for purifying from sin. Now, there's some aspects of Jewish worship and practices that are looking ahead to Jesus Christ, but others had a medical purpose, which tells us of something of the divine intellect behind the commands. And I want you to think about this water of purification, right? At first glance, when you think about the water purification, it sounds like a hodgepodge of superstitious potion making that included these ashes of a red heifer and hyssop and cedar wood and scarlet. But this formula was the furthest thing from a symbolic potion intended to ward off evil spirits. On the contrary, the recipe for the water of purification stands today as a wonderful example of the Bible's brilliance, because the recipe is nothing less than a procedure to produce an antibacterial soap. Now, if you want antibacterial soap, where do you get it? We just go to the store, pick us up some Safeguard or whatever soap you're using, We used Safeguard when I was growing up. I use Dove now. There you go. But antibacterial soap, you just buy at the store. We have no idea how soap is even made anymore, do we? Because we don't have to make our own soap. We wouldn't know how to make soap if we had to make it ourselves. But when we look at the ingredients individually here of this water purification, you begin to see the value of each one. First of all, consider the ashes of a red heifer and cedar. I don't know where your kids go on field trips, but when my kids grew up in Indiana, there was a little place they took a field trip. It was this place called Conner Prairie up in Indiana. And Conner Prairie is basically this old village. And they would go from house to house, and everybody was dressed up in old-timey garb, kind of like the Renaissance fair, I guess, right? And they pretended, they showed kids, this is how we would have had to have cooked food. This is how we would have had to have made soap in our day. And they just kind of reenact what it was like to be one of the first pioneers. And you learn that thing. And so some school children know this, I'm assuming. The pioneers in this country didn't go to the supermarket and buy their favorite personal hygiene products. If they needed soap or shampoo, they made it themselves. Now, under such situations, they concocted various recipes for soap. And one of the most oft-produced types of soap is lye soap, right? Practically anybody today can easily obtain a recipe for lye soap if you just do a quick search of the internet. You can make your own soap if you want to. The various lye soap recipes reveal that to obtain lye, water is poured through ashes. The water retrieved from pouring it through ashes contains a concentration of lye. And lye, in high concentrations, is very caustic. It's very irritating to the skin. It's, in fact, one of the main ingredients in many modern chemical mixtures that's used to unclog drains. In most diluted concentrations, it can be used as an exfoliant or a cleansing agent. Many companies today still produce lye soaps. Moses instructed the Israelites to prepare a mixture that would have included lye that was mixed in a diluted solution. Now, what about these other things that got thrown into the ashes? Well, he also says that you should put cedar wood. Now, this is the part of the sermon that makes all the crunchy moms happy, okay? If you're into essential oils and you've got somebody in your life telling you that those oils will do you no good, here is your biblical justification to stay crunchy, moms, okay? Other ingredients in the water of purification stand out as having beneficial properties. For example, the oil from the cedar wood in the mixture most likely maintain numerous salutary properties. There's a website that deals with various essential oils that notes this about cedar wood. Cedar wood has long been used for storage cabinets because of its ability to repel insects and prevent decay. We had a cedar closet in the house I grew up in. That was the purpose. It kept the insects out. In oil form, applied to humans, it is an antiseptic, astringent expectorant. It removes mucus from the respiratory system. It is antifungal, it is a sedative, and it is an insecticide. Another site, more specifically dealing with the beneficial properties of cedar, explained it this way. It says cedar leaves and twigs are in fact rich in vitamin C. It was their effectiveness in preventing or treating scurvy that led to the trees being called arbor vitae, or the tree of life. That was a cedar tree. In addition, recent research has shown that extracts prepared from either Thuja occidentalis or basically types of oriental cedar, they do in fact have antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and antibacterial properties. There was a group of German researchers that reported in 2002 that an extract prepared from cedar leaf, alcohol, and water inhibits the reproduction of influenza virus type A. And there was a team of researchers in Japan that found that an extract of western red cedar was effective in treating eczema. Now, some may wonder, right? How could you have cedarwood oil if the wood was being burnt? The oils are still in the ashes. Did you know that you can get poison ivy from inhaling the smoke from burning poison ivy because the oil's in the smoke? Do you know you can still get poison ivy from the wood even though there's no poison ivy leaves present? I learned that the hard way, right? I'm out there chainsawing one winter, this big old fat poison ivy vine, it's flying all over me, and I got poison ivy everywhere. I didn't see any leaves, but it was still in the wood, right? The oil's still in the wood. Oils are in the air, oils are in the wood, oils are in the ash, and so it's still potent. And likewise, cedarwood oil would have still been effective through the ashes. And that's something perhaps we're only recently realizing. It's interesting to know this information about the beneficial properties of the ingredients such as cedar, hyssop, and lye in the water of purification. Well, that's not coming from Bible-based sources. Most of it is simply coming from studies that have been done through cosmetic and therapeutic research. Now, there's also hyssop in the water of purification. That's one of the other ingredients Hyssop contains the antiseptic thymol. That's the same ingredient that we find in many brands of mouthwash today. Hyssop oil continues to be a popular healing oil. It's actually very expensive. And listing the benefits of hyssop, one website noted this: once used for purifying temples and cleansing lepers, the leaves contain an antiseptic, antiviral oil. A mold that produces penicillin grows on the leaves. An infusion is taken as a sedative expectorant for flu, for bronchitis, and for phlegm. And finally, the Israelites were supposed to toss into the mix scarlet, which most likely was scarlet wool. If you look at Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 19, a little reference to that, adding wool fibers to the concoction would have made the mixture the ancient equivalent of lava soap. Thousands of years before any formal studies were done to see what type of cleansing methods were the most effective for germs, millennia before American pioneers concocted their lye solutions, and ages before our most advanced medical students knew a thing about germ theory, Moses instructed the Israelites to concoct an amazingly effective recipe for soap that, if used properly in medical facilities and hospitals like those in Vienna, it would have literally saved thousands of lives. A water of purification is not some ancient superstitious concoction. It was the ancient equivalent of an antibacterial soap, which would have killed and limited the spread of disease. All right, here's a fourth one. A fourth example of the medical foreknowledge, and it's quarantine. And that's something we got real familiar with during COVID, right? People said, quarantine, stay away from other people if you're sick. Well, there's a reason why, because we understand how germs are spread, and we don't want those germs to be spread in that way. When you read Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45, you may think that the law's instructions on the treatment of lepers, that seems kind of cruel, but it was really an act of compassion. You were supposed to stay away from lepers because God didn't want leprosy spreading throughout the camp, and one of the ways that you control that is you quarantine yourself. So Leviticus 13:45 says, the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, his head bare, he shall cover his mustache. Isn't that what you do when you're trying not to let the germs fly out? You cover your face. Well, what we do today is we just mask. But he was supposed to take his hand, basically, or maybe a handkerchief, cover it up, and cry out when someone came near, unclean, unclean. We do the same thing. Sometimes maybe you've been coughing a little bit or you're not feeling too well. I'm not going to shake hands today. I'm not feeling very well today. I'm going to keep my distance from you today. That's what the leper did. Unclean, unclean, and he shall be unclean. And all the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean. He shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. I might seem like a kind of mean dad, but when my kids are sick, coughing, fevery, stay away from me. I love you. I'll bring soup. I'll drop it at your door. But stay away from me because I don't want to get sick. I got to call somebody else to preach for me when I'm sick. So I think it's a nice thing to stay away from people when you're sick, by the way. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that out there. If you're sick and you're fever, stay home. You don't have to come to church. God understands when the ox is in the ditch and when you're not well, it's okay. All right, there's my 2 cents there. You know, Massengill, in a sketch of medicine pharmacist, says this: in the prevention of disease, however, the ancient Hebrews made real progress. The teachings of Moses, as embodied in the priestly code of the Old Testament, contain two clear conceptions of modern sanitation: the importance of cleanliness and the possibility of controlling epidemic disease by isolation and quarantine. Quarantine. This isn't a new idea. We stay away from people. And we try to cover up to try to prevent the spread of disease. This is from the Encyclopedia of Medical History. And this is what the Encyclopedia of Medical History states. It says, the idea of contagion was foreign to the classic medical tradition and found no place in the voluminous Hippocratic writings. The Old Testament, however, is a rich source for contagionist sentiment, especially in regard to leprosy and venereal disease. All right, last one. And for some reason, that word got scrunched. But the last one is just simply the practice of circumcision. Everybody knows this is an Old Testament practice, common among Israel, required among Israel when you had a male child. But in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 12, it says this: "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male child in your generations.
Is winning.
He who is born in your house or bought with money from any foreigner who is not your descendant. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money must be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant." Now, notice also the specific day that the Hebrew child was supposed to be circumcised. It was supposed to be on the 8th day. All right. The covenant with Abraham and his offspring was to be indelibly marked in the flesh of every male child. The practice of circumcision, actually somewhat a hot topic today. There are some people who feel as though circumcision is an evil practice. There's some interesting research which indicates, though, that there are medical advantages to circumcising a child. In the New Covenant, I will just simply point out, the New Covenant says circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything. Certainly, spiritually speaking, I think that's the case with regard to our salvation. But there is some medical research, interestingly, that does mention that it does help us physically. For example, pediatrician Deborah Greenbaum noted 2 positive results of circumcision in her studies. Some studies indicate 10 to 20 times more UTIs, that's urinary tract infections, in uncircumcised boys than circumcised. And she also noted that STDs are passed, that's be sexually transmitted diseases, are passed more readily among uncircumcised men. Brian Morris, who's an evolutionist, he's not even a believer, but he points this out, that penile cancer occurs almost entirely in uncircumcised men, almost entirely. And so there are some physical benefits, but the benefit that I want you to think about as you think about circumcision of the Old Testament is actually taking a look at what day they had to perform a circumcision in the Old Testament. They performed it on the 8th day. The date Moses commanded circumcision is important because of certain facts that are found in medical textbooks today concerning circumcision. For example, the danger of excessive bleeding during circumcision is peculiarly higher on the 2nd through the 5th days of life, right after a male child is born. And the reason why is because there's a vitamin K deficiency in days 2 through 5 that lead to a lower level of prothrombin, which leads to decreased blood clotting. Now, what's interesting is that prothrombin levels are at around 110% on day 8 of a child's life, making it the perfect day to perform a circumcision. For one, infants are more resilient. They can recover before their next feeding. A teenager takes a week to recover from a circumcision. For two, the blood clots better between days 6 and 8 of a child's life because the prothrombin levels are at the highest they will ever be in that child's life. How did Moses know about those facts? That day 8 would be the best day to practice circumcision. Was it a lucky guess? Or was there a God behind it? Well, I think it's evidence of the medical foreknowledge of God. And I hope some of these examples have convinced you of the same. There are a lot of examples that we could look at. Entire books could be written on the Old Testament's amazing medical accuracy, have been written on the Old Testament's amazing medical accuracy. We could talk about the wisdom of God's plan for one man, one woman in marriage and how it would drastically reduce STDs and diseases connected with sexual immorality and multiple partners. We could talk about some of the dietary restrictions of the Jews, such as the unclean meats they were supposed to avoid and God's instructions to avoid reptiles, bats, unclean fish, unclean birds, and pork. Many studies could be cited to point out the wisdom of these instructions and that these unclean animals commonly carry more diseases such as salmonella, often carried by reptiles, rabies, often carried by bats, trichinosis that's often passed through the consumption of ill-prepared pork, and the toxicity of certain unclean fish such as blowfish and the dangers of alcohol. We could talk about that as well and how the Bible repeatedly warns of the consequences of intoxicating drink. Do you realize that 40% of auto insurance claims go to alcohol-related accidents? But we need to put together an entire lesson to cover all of these laws of food consumption. But many studies have proven the wisdom of these practices. Well, if God is that wise about trying to help the physical man, I guess our concluding question would be, are you willing to trust what God says to you about how he can help your spiritual man? Because God didn't just want to give us his word to help us physically. Jesus came as a physician for the soul because he knew men were in need of repentance and healing because of their soul sickness. There's some people, they think it's real interesting to hear about these things physically, and yet they have not yet turned to Jesus so that they might help, so that he might heal them and help them spiritually. Forgive them of their sins so that you might be made right with God. If you haven't been made right with the great physician, well, he's here right now to help you, to heal you, to forgive you, so that you can be cleansed in his sight. If you're ready to be made right with him, won't you come while we stand, while we sing?